I built that company with my own hands, and my own son looked me in the eyes and said, "You don't deserve to run it anymore." Then he fired me in front of every employee I'd worked beside for over 30 years. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I simply picked up the family photo from my desk, wished everyone the best, and walked out. 3 days later, the biggest investor our company had ever signed asked one question that changed everything. "Where's Daniel?" If you've ever seen a family tear itself apart over money, I'd appreciate you subscribing to Family Betrayal. Stories like mine remind us how quickly success can disappear when pride takes over. And before we go any further, the faces, photos, and scenes you see in this video are only visual illustrations to help tell the story. They aren't real recordings of the people involved. When I started the business, I was 26 with a pickup truck, a borrowed toolbox, and more determination than common sense. My wife believed in me before anyone else did. We worked weekends, skipped vacations, and poured every dollar back into the company. Years later, we had over 100 employees, clients across several states, and a reputation that meant everything to me. My son, Ethan, grew up watching that success. I wanted him to have opportunities one never had. I paid for college, gave him a management position, and slowly introduced him to leadership. At first, I was proud. He was smart, confident, and ambitious. But confidence slowly turned into arrogance. He stopped asking questions and started acting like every success belonged to him. Whenever someone praised the company, he'd smile as if he'd built it himself. The first time he publicly corrected me during a meeting, everyone laughed awkwardly. I laughed too, pretending it didn't hurt. Looking back, maybe that was my biggest mistake. I ignored the warning signs because he was my son. But I had no idea he was already planning something that would change both our lives forever. The weeks that followed felt different. Conversations stopped whenever I entered a room. Managers who had worked beside me for decades suddenly looked nervous before speaking. My assistant accidentally left a folder on my desk one afternoon, and inside was an organizational chart with my name removed. Ethan's name sat at the top, where mine had always been. My stomach dropped. I wanted to believe it was only a draft, but deep down I knew something was happening behind my back. When I confronted Ethan privately, he smiled and told me I was overthinking everything. He said the company needed fresh leadership to compete with younger businesses. Hearing my own son talk about me like I was outdated hurt more than I expected. I reminded him that experience wasn't something you replaced with confidence. He shrugged and walked away without another word. A few days later, every employee received a message ordering them into the conference room for a mandatory meeting. I walked in expecting to discuss a new contract. Instead, Ethan stood at the front beside our attorney and the HR director. He cleared his throat and announced that the board had voted to appoint him as CEO. Before I could even process those words, he turned toward me. "Dad, it's time for you to step aside. Effective immediately, you're no longer employed here." The room went completely silent. People I'd known for 30 years stared at the floor because they couldn't bear to look at me. A few employees looked furious, but nobody spoke. Ethan handed me an envelope containing termination papers and a security badge request. He acted like I was just another employee being let go. I felt my face burning with embarrassment, but I refused to give him the reaction he wanted. I quietly placed my company keys on the table, picked up the framed photo of my late wife, and thanked everyone for the years we had shared together. As I walked toward the exit, I heard someone quietly whisper, "This isn't right." I didn't turn around. What would you have done in my place? Fought back in front of everyone, or walked away with your dignity intact? When the elevator doors closed, I believed I had lost everything I'd spent my entire life building. I had no idea that 3 days later a single phone call from the biggest investor in the company's history would leave Ethan wishing he had never humiliated me in front of those employees. For the first 2 days after I left, I barely slept. Every morning I reached for my phone, expecting messages from employees asking what had happened. Instead, there was mostly silence. I kept replaying that meeting in my head, wondering if I had failed as a father long before I failed as a CEO. Losing my position hurt, but realizing my own son believed I was worthless hurt even more. On the third morning, my phone finally rang. The caller ID showed the name of Richard Lawson, the founder of the investment group that had funded our biggest expansion 5 years earlier. He wasn't just another investor. His company had invested nearly $50 million and opened doors I could never have opened alone. "Daniel," he said, I'm flying in this afternoon. Tell Ethan I'll meet him after I speak with you. I paused. He fired me 3 days ago. The line went completely silent. What do you mean he fired you? I explained everything. I didn't exaggerate. I simply told him the truth. When I finished, Richard let out a long breath. I'll see you in an hour. Instead of going to company headquarters, Richard asked me to meet him at a quiet coffee shop. For almost 2 hours we talked about the business, our employees, and the values that had built the company. Before leaving, he looked me straight in the eye. I didn't invest because of your equipment. I didn't invest because of your buildings. I invested because I trusted you. If you're gone, my confidence is gone. Later that afternoon, Richard walked into the boardroom where Ethan had proudly taken my seat. Every director expected another routine meeting. Instead, Richard pushed his folder across the table. I have one question, he said calmly. Where is Daniel? Ethan smiled and answered. We decided it was time for new leadership. Richard didn't smile back. Then my investment group has made a decision too. The room froze. He opened the folder and informed the board that unless I was immediately brought back, every future investment, expansion project, and line of credit his firm had promised would be canceled. Even worse, several partnership agreements contained leadership clauses tied directly to my continued involvement. The confident look on Ethan's face disappeared in seconds. That's when he finally realized. He hadn't fired the man who built the company. He had just destroyed the future he thought he had inherited. No one in that boardroom expected Richard's announcement to travel so fast. By the next morning, 2 other investors called asking the same question. Is Daniel really gone? When they learned the answer, they immediately paused their projects. Banks delayed approvals. Longtime clients requested meetings before renewing contracts. The business Ethan thought he controlled began slipping through his fingers. Late that evening, my phone rang again. It was Ethan. For the first time in years, he didn't sound confident. Dad, can we talk? I agreed to meet him, but not at the office. We met in the small diner where I'd once celebrated landing my very first customer. He walked in looking exhausted. The expensive suit couldn't hide the fear on his face. I made a mistake, he whispered. I looked at him for a long moment before answering. No, Ethan. A mistake is forgetting someone's birthday. What you did was a choice. Tears filled his eyes. He admitted that a few board members had convinced him the company would grow faster without me. They praised his ideas, fed his ego, and made him believe I was holding everyone back. He wanted to prove he was stronger than the man who built the business. Instead, he learned that trust is something you earn over decades, not something you inherit with a job title. The following week, the board held an emergency meeting. Several directors who had supported Ethan resigned after shareholders demanded accountability. They unanimously voted to reinstate me as CEO. I accepted, but only on one condition. I refused to humiliate my son the way he had humiliated me. Instead of firing him in front of everyone, I asked him to step down from leadership and spend a year working alongside different departments, from the warehouse to customer service, to understand the people who actually made the company successful. If he wanted another chance, he had to earn respect the same way I had. He accepted without arguing. Over the next year, I watched him change. He apologized personally to employees he had ignored. He listened more than he talked. Slowly, the arrogance disappeared. For the first time in a long while, I didn't just see an executive, I saw my son again. Today, the company is stronger than ever. I'm no longer chasing bigger buildings or higher profits. I'm protecting the values that built everything in the first place, because I learned the hardest lesson of my life. A business can survive losing money, but it rarely survives losing integrity. If you've stayed with me until the end, thank you. I'd love to know, what would you have done if your own child fired you in front of everyone? Would you have forgiven them, or walked away forever? Share your thoughts in the comments because every perspective matters. If this story touched you, please share it with someone who believes family should never come before honesty. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Family Betrayal for more emotional stories about trust, betrayal, and the moments that change lives forever. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't getting your company back. It's getting your family back, one honest choice at a time.